Gideon Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Eliza Monroe's small rented room like he owned the building, because, technically, he did, and he dropped a single envelope onto the table in front of her without a word. Inside were two things: a one-way train ticket out of the county and a photograph of Wyatt Callahan standing outside his ranch with a woman Eliza had never seen before. "He moved on," Gideon said, straightening his coat. "You should too." Eliza's hands didn't shake, but her eyes told the whole story. If the person you loved most was taken from you by a lie you never saw coming, what would you do when you finally learned the truth? This is the story of Eliza Monroe, Wyatt Callahan, and the 12 years that a powerful man stole from them both. If this story speaks to something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, because the truth, when it finally comes out, will shake you to your core. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The cold came early that October. Wyatt Callahan had been awake since before the sun crested the ridge, the way he'd been every morning for the past 12 years. Not because the ranch demanded it, though it did, but because sleep had never fully returned to him after she left. He functioned on 4, maybe 5 hours, and filled the rest of the dark morning hours with work, mending fence posts, feeding the horses, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that went cold before he ever finished it, staring at a stretch of land that had once felt like a promise and now just felt like responsibility. He was 41 years old, and he looked it, not in a defeated way, more like a man who had been tested repeatedly by weather and loss and hard seasons, and had simply stopped pretending any of it was easy. His hands were rough. His jaw carried 2 days of gray-flecked stubble most of the time. He walked with the slight hitch of an old injury in his left hip that had never healed quite right after a horse threw him the winter before last. He was not a bitter man. He had worked hard not to become one. But on that particular morning, standing at the fence line watching the frozen ground catch the first pale light of dawn, Wyatt Callahan felt the particular quiet loneliness that had lived in his chest for over a decade. The kind that didn't announce itself anymore, just settled in like weather. He heard the sound of hoofbeats before he saw anything. A carriage, moving up the long dirt road that led to his property from the main road into Harlan's Creek. Not a local rig. The wheels were too clean, the horse too well kept. Someone from outside the county. He squinted through the cold air and watched it slow to a stop at the edge of his yard. He didn't move toward it right away. He'd learned over the years to let people come to him. Salesmen, lawyers representing land buyers, the occasional stranger with a sob story. They all expected him to walk out to greet them. Wyatt had stopped performing hospitality for people he didn't know. He waited. The carriage door opened. A woman stepped down first, and Wyatt's entire body, every nerve, every muscle, 12 years of carefully constructed distance, stopped working all at once. He knew her before he could see her face clearly. He knew the way she moved, the particular way she held herself when she was bracing for something difficult. Chin slightly lifted, shoulders not quite squared, like she was prepared to absorb a blow but hadn't decided yet whether to stand her ground or run. Eliza. The name didn't come as a thought. It came the way a wound opens, sudden and complete. She was older. Of course she was. They both were. Her hair, which had once been loose and dark and careless around her shoulders, was pinned back now, neat and deliberate. She wore a gray traveling coat that had seen better days. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. 12 years had shaped her the same way the land had shaped him. You could see every hard season in her if you knew how to look. And then a second figure emerged from the carriage behind her. A child. A girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, stepping carefully down from the carriage step with the kind of seriousness that didn't belong on a child's face. She wore a brown wool coat, and her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid. She reached up and took Eliza's hand without being asked, without looking around nervously the way most children would when arriving somewhere new. She looked straight at Wyatt. And that was when the world tilted. Because the girl's eyes, the exact particular shade of gray-green, the slight downward tilt at the outer corners, the way they didn't blink away from direct contact, were his. They were unmistakably, impossibly his. Wyatt didn't move. He wasn't sure he was breathing. Eliza crossed the yard toward him slowly, not like someone who had rehearsed this. Like someone who had rehearsed this 500 times and still wasn't ready. Her jaw was set and her eyes were steady, but he could see the pulse at her throat working fast, the way it always had when she was frightened. She stopped about 6 feet away from him. "Wyatt," she said. Just his name. No apology leading up to it, no explanation, just his name in her voice, which he had spent 12 years trying to forget and had failed completely. He looked at the girl. The girl looked back at him, not shy, not hiding behind her mother, just watching him with those impossible eyes. "Her name is Lillian," Eliza said. Her voice was careful and even, and cost her something to keep that way. He could tell. "She's 11 years old." Wyatt did the arithmetic without meaning to. The silence between them stretched out long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "Eliza." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "What did you do?" She didn't flinch. "I made impossible choices because impossible things were done to us. And I'm here now to tell you everything." He looked away from her, looked at the girl again. "Lillian," she'd said. The child was studying him with an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself. She was trying to figure out if he was someone worth trusting, not in the hopeful way children sometimes trust strangers, in the careful, already been disappointed way. That expression, more than the eyes, more than the math, more than Eliza standing in his yard after 12 years, that expression gutted him. "Come inside, Mutt," he said. But he made coffee because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. Eliza sat at his kitchen table, the same table he'd built himself the second year after she left, when he'd needed to build something to keep from falling apart completely, and the girl sat beside her, straight-backed, watching him move around the kitchen. Not a word from either of them, not yet. Wyatt set 3 cups down and sat across from them. He didn't pour the coffee right away. He looked at Eliza. "Start," he said. "From the beginning." She clasped her hands on the table. "From the beginning is a long time ago." "We're not going anywhere." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement that they were both still standing, that the years between them hadn't erased the particular way they'd always communicated. Direct. Without softening things, they didn't need to soften. "Before I say anything," she said, "I need you to know that I didn't leave you." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He'd spent years building walls around exactly this, around the moment he might have to sit across from her and hear her say something that would either confirm his worst assumptions or unravel them. He'd decided, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th year of silence, that the walls were there to protect him. He wasn't ready for them to come down without warning. "The letters," he started. "Were forged," she said, quietly, evenly. "Every single one." The kitchen was very still. Lillian reached over and put her small hand on top of her mother's clasped hands, a gesture so adult and practiced that it meant she'd done it before, many times in many hard moments, and it hit Wyatt somewhere behind the sternum in a way he wasn't prepared for. "Who?" he asked, though some part of him, the part that had never fully stopped turning this question over in the dark, already suspected. "Gideon Voss," Eliza said. The name landed in the room like something heavy dropped on wood. Wyatt sat back slowly. He knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. Gideon Voss had been a land official even back then, younger, but already building the empire of favors and threats and careful manipulation that now made him untouchable in this part of the territory. He was the kind of man who had never needed to raise his voice because his power raised it for him. "He wanted me," Eliza said. "I told him no. More than once." She looked down at her hands for the first time, and that small break in her composure was the most honest thing she'd shown him since she walked in. "I didn't understand what that meant to a man like him. I didn't understand that when a man like Gideon Voss doesn't get what he wants, he doesn't walk away. He removes the obstacle." "I was the obstacle," Wyatt said. "We were the obstacle," she corrected. "Our future was." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the morning light was strengthening, cold and white, catching the frost on the fence posts. "I got a letter," he said finally. "In your handwriting, saying you'd made your choice and it wasn't me." "I got one too," she said. "In yours, saying you'd realized I wasn't what you wanted." They looked at each other across the table. 12 years. 2 forged letters, one man with enough power to rewrite both their lives. "I was 17 weeks along when I left," Eliza said. Her voice didn't crack, but it was close. "I didn't know yet. And then I was in Cheyenne, alone, with no money and no way back to you that Gideon hadn't already sealed off, and I found out I was going to have a child." "You could have sent word," Wyatt said, and he heard the old hurt in his voice and hated it. "Eliza, you could have found a way." "Gideon had people watching everything," she said. "Every letter I sent through the post came back unopened. Every person I trusted to carry a message to you turned up later working for him. I tried for 8 months, Wyatt. 8 months of trying before I understood that he wasn't just blocking me. He was using my attempts to build a case that I was a troubled woman who needed to be managed." Her voice had gone harder now, the softness replaced by something that had been forged in years of surviving. "He threatened to take her, before she was even born. He told me through an intermediary that if I caused trouble, if I came back, if I made any noise at all, he had the connections to have my child taken from me the moment she drew breath." Wyatt stared at her. "That was not an idle threat," she said. "From a man like him, in that time, in this territory, that was a certainty." He looked at Lillian. The girl had been listening to all of this with the same still, careful attention, not distressed, not confused, like she had heard this story before, or pieces of it, and was watching to see how Wyatt received it more than listening to the content. "Did you know?" Wyatt asked her, directly. Lillian blinked. It was the first moment of anything close to surprise on her face. Most adults didn't ask her things directly. "That my father was alive," she said. "I knew you existed. Mama told me that much. She didn't tell me your name until last year." "Why last year?" Lillian looked at her mother, then back at him. "Because that's when Voss started threatening her again." It came out in pieces over the next 2 hours. Eliza had built a life in Cheyenne, then in a small town east of the Powder River, doing what women alone with children did. Taking in sewing, keeping house for families who needed extra help, teaching the few months a year when a school teacher was required. She had kept herself small and quiet, because small and quiet meant Gideon Voss had no reason to look her direction. For years it worked. Lillian grew up knowing her mother was careful, knowing there were things they didn't say in public, routes they didn't take, people they didn't trust easily. She thought it was simply the way life was until she was old enough to understand that her mother carried a specific fear, not a general one. Then 3 months ago, a man in a suit arrived at the school where Eliza had been working and handed her a note. The note was brief. "The commissioner wants to resolve things properly. Come home or he will come to you." Gideon Voss was running for a federal land position. A major one. And somewhere in the documents required for that process, or in the gossip that followed ambitious men, Eliza's existence, and her daughter's, had surfaced as a potential problem. Not because of what she knew, because of what she could prove. "I still have them," Eliza said. She reached into the worn leather bag she'd carried in with her and set a cloth envelope on the table. "The original letters, the ones he forged. I found them. It took me 4 years, it cost me everything I'd saved, and I nearly lost them twice. But I have them. His handwriting, his seal, dates that don't match what he claimed." Wyatt didn't touch the envelope. He was looking at her. "You came back," he said slowly, "because he's threatening you again." "I came back," she said, "because I am done letting that man determine the shape of my life." There was something in her voice that hadn't been there when she arrived. The fear had shifted, compressed into something denser and harder. And because Lillian deserves to know her father, and because 12 years of carrying a lie I didn't create is enough. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. The coffee sat cold and untouched in all 3 cups. He thought about the first winter after she left, the way he'd worked until his hands bled because stopping meant thinking. He thought about the letter he'd read and reread for months, trying to find some hidden meaning that made it make sense. He thought about the morning he'd finally put it in the fire and watched it burn, and told himself it was the last time he would think about Eliza Monroe. He had been wrong about that. He was wrong about it every single morning for the next 11 years. He looked at Lillian. She was watching him with those eyes that were his eyes, her chin set at an angle he recognized in the mirror. 11 years, he said. Not to anyone in particular. 11 years and 4 months, Lillian said, with the particular precision of a child who has always known her own age mattered to this conversation before the conversation ever happened. Wyatt almost laughed. The sound that came out wasn't quite a laugh. It was too full of things that weren't funny, but it was something. Do you want something to eat? He asked her. You must have been traveling since before light. Lillian looked at her mother. Eliza nodded slightly. Yes, please, Lillian said. And for just a moment, a fraction of a second, she looked like exactly what she was, a tired, uncertain child who had traveled a very long way and wasn't sure yet if the destination had been worth it. Wyatt got up and went to the stove. His back was to them. He needed a moment where they couldn't see his face. He gripped the edge of the stovetop and stood there for a count of 5, breathing through the thing that was happening in his chest. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, something that was all of it at once, 12 years compressed into a single moment that he had no preparation for. Then he picked up the skillet, because the child was hungry, and right now that was the one thing he knew what to do about. He made eggs and salt pork and biscuits that were decent but not perfect. The biscuits never came out perfectly when he made them alone. Something about the amount of butter, he'd never quite figured it out. And he set the plate in front of Lillian without ceremony. She ate like she hadn't eaten since morning, which she probably hadn't. Eliza held her own plate but didn't eat much. She watched him, cautious and exhausted, like someone who had run a very long race and wasn't certain the finish line was actually where she thought it was. What happens now? Wyatt asked. I don't know, Eliza said. And that honesty, the admission from a woman who had survived 11 years alone through sheer relentlessness that she genuinely did not know, hit him differently than anything else she'd said. Voss doesn't know you're here, he said. He knows I left Cheyenne. He'll find out where I've gone. How long do we have? Days, she said. A week, maybe. Wyatt nodded slowly. He looked around his kitchen, the home he'd built in the years after she left, solid and functional and completely without softness. No curtains on the windows, no flowers, nothing that spoke of anything except a man who lived alone and had made his peace with it. You can stay, he said. Both of you, you can stay here. Eliza's chin came up slightly. I'm not asking you to fight my battles. You didn't ask, he said. I told you. She was quiet. I have 11 years of things I don't know how to apologize for not knowing, Wyatt said. I can't undo any of it, but I can start with making sure you're not standing alone against that man. Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and then something in her face, some piece of the armor she'd spent over a decade carefully building, cracked, just slightly, just for a second, before she pulled it back together. Okay, she said. Lillian, without looking up from her plate, said, Good. Outside, the October wind moved through the tall, dry grass. The ranch was quiet in the cold morning light, the kind of quiet that holds something, a decision, a reckoning, the particular tension of things that have been set in motion that cannot be unmoved. Wyatt Callahan had survived the worst that Montana could throw at him. He had survived loss and winter, and the particular loneliness of a man who had loved once and believed he never would again. But standing in his own kitchen, looking at the daughter he hadn't known existed for 11 years, he understood something that he hadn't been prepared for. Surviving wasn't the same as living. And somewhere between the two, in the years he'd spent just keeping the ranch going and keeping himself going, he had forgotten the difference. He wasn't sure yet what came next, but for the first time in 12 years, the cold morning quiet in his chest felt less like emptiness and more like the held breath before something begins. Lillian slept like the dead that first afternoon. Wyatt had given her the small room at the back of the house, the one he'd originally built intending it to be a second bedroom, then spent 12 years using as storage for saddle repair equipment and old fencing tools. He'd cleared it out in under an hour, while Eliza sat at the kitchen table drinking the coffee that had finally been poured hot, not saying anything. watching him move back and forth with armloads of gear he deposited in the barn without ceremony. He didn't own a proper second bed. He pulled the spare mattress down from the loft. It was old but clean. He'd kept it because throwing things out had never come naturally to him, and set it on the floor with 2 folded wool blankets and a pillow that had seen better days. Lillian stood in the doorway looking at it without complaint. "It's fine," she said. "It's not great," Wyatt said. "I've slept on worse," she said, and something about the way she said it, matter of fact, without self-pity, made his stomach tighten in a way he didn't let show on his face. She was asleep within 20 minutes of lying down, still wearing her traveling clothes, one arm crooked under the old pillow. Eliza stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her, and Wyatt stood a few feet back looking at both of them, and the scene was so quietly enormous that he had to walk away from it before it did something to him he wasn't ready for. He went out to the barn. He did what he always did when he needed to think without thinking. He worked, checked the water troughs, inspected the hooves on his 2 working horses, mended a section of rope halter that had been fraying for a week. His hands knew what to do without his mind having to direct them, and that was what he needed right now. His mind was already too loud. Eliza found him there an hour later. She stood at the barn entrance without coming in, the way people do when they aren't sure of their welcome in a space that belongs to someone else. The afternoon light was flat and pale behind her. "She does that," Eliza said. "Falls asleep hard when she's been anxious. She holds everything together while things are uncertain, and then when she finally lets herself stop, she just goes." "A smart kid," Wyatt said, not looking up from the halter. "She is." A pause. "She's stubborn too, and she argues with logic when she thinks she's right, which is often, and she doesn't back down easily. She gets that from—" Eliza stopped. Wyatt looked up. Eliza looked at the ground. "I was going to say she gets it from you, but I can't know that really. I knew who you were at 23. People change." "Some things don't," he said. She finally came into the barn, walking to the opposite side of the space and leaning against the post there the way she used to lean against fence posts when they were young and talking through some decision. He recognized the posture. He wished he didn't. "I need to tell you more about what happened," she said. "Not just the outline. The rest of it. You deserve the rest of it." "I know," he said. "But maybe tonight, when you've rested too." "I'm not going to be able to rest, Wyatt." He looked at her properly then. In the barn light, she looked more tired than she had in the kitchen. The adrenaline of the arrival was wearing off, and what was underneath it was years of carrying something very heavy through terrain that kept getting harder. He recognized exhaustion that deep. He'd worn it himself. "Then tell me," he said. He set the halter down and leaned against the stall door. "I'm not going anywhere." She took a breath. Then she told him the part she'd left out in front of Lillian. The first 3 years after she left Harlan's Creek were the worst, she said. She'd gone to Cheyenne with less money than she'd thought she had, because the travel cost more than she'd planned, because everything always cost more than you planned when you were young and had never done it before. She found a room above a laundry. She found work in the laundry below it. The smell never left her clothes for months. She had Lillian in a room above that laundry with a midwife who charged half up front and the other half in labor. She was 24 years old and alone, and the birth was long and hard and nothing like the vague, soft thing she'd imagined birth might be. It was 3 days of something she said she could not properly describe, and at the end of it she held a small and furious person who had her nose in Wyatt's eyes, and she had cried for the first time since leaving Montana. Not from pain, though there was pain, but from the specific grief of being alone in that moment when she had always imagined he would be there. Wyatt didn't say anything. He kept his face neutral. He was not always successful at it. She had tried, she said again, to reach him. She was not going to let him hold that against her without understanding what she'd tried. She wrote 7 letters in those first 8 months. She found 3 different people traveling toward Montana and paid them what she could to carry word. Every avenue closed. She hired a man to look into it. Spent 2 weeks of wages on him. And he came back and told her flatly that every channel of communication between her and anyone in Harlan's Creek had been, as near as he could tell, deliberately monitored and shut down. The man's name was Voss, he said. He was well known in those circles. The man who'd hired him to look into it, him, the investigator, had been paid twice what she was paying to report back to Voss directly. That was when she understood the scale of it. Not a man who had interfered, a man who had constructed an entire wall around her, who was still watching, still maintaining the separation, still making sure that even her attempts to correct the situation confirmed to anyone watching that she was an unstable and unreliable woman making trouble. That was when I stopped trying to go around him, she said, and started trying to find a way through. The cloth envelope with the documents in it had taken 4 years to assemble. The first piece of evidence was an accident, a letter in Gideon Voss's own hand, misfiled by a careless clerk in the county records office, that she'd found while looking through deed transactions for an entirely different reason. It used careful language, the kind a careful man uses, but combined with what she already knew, it was a brick in the wall she was building. The rest of it she collected piece by piece. A woman who had worked as Voss's housekeeper and had reason to hate him. A former clerk who had left the county in a hurry and was willing to talk for the price of a train ticket somewhere else. A copy of the original letter, the forged one, in what she described as an imitation of Wyatt's handwriting that was good but not perfect, that she'd managed to obtain from a records box that Voss had carelessly stored rather than destroyed. She had built the case slowly, patiently, the way you build something when you know it has to hold weight. "Why didn't you use it?" Wyatt asked. "If you had the evidence, why not against Gideon Voss?" She said it quietly, but the weight in it was significant. "In what court? Before what judge?" "Wyatt, this man has owned 3 county judges since before I left. He has friends in the territorial government. Using evidence against someone like that without the right moment and the right audience doesn't expose him. It gives him warning. And a warned man with his resources destroys evidence and then destroys the person who brought it." Wyatt was quiet. "I waited," she said, "because waiting was the only weapon I had." He thought about what that kind of waiting cost. 12 years of it. Holding something that could change everything. And knowing you couldn't use it yet. Living small so you didn't get noticed. Raising a child alone and keeping the fear from showing too much on your face so she didn't carry more of your burden than she already did. "You said he's threatening you again," Wyatt said. "What exactly does he want?" Eliza's jaw shifted. "He wants the evidence. He knows I have something. He's not sure exactly what, but he knows I've been collecting pieces for years. He's been more careful about that. He has people looking." She paused. "And he wants to be certain that Lillian cannot ever be used as a problem. She's his. She's evidence of his obsession with me. If it ever came out in a public forum who he is and what he did, a child left without a father because of his interference becomes a very compelling detail." "He wants to take her from you," Wyatt said. "He wants to neutralize the threat she represents," Eliza said. And those words were the most cold and precise she'd spoken, the words of a woman who had been living inside this danger long enough to understand it clinically. Which means one of 2 things. Either controlling her situation or removing her from it. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a low, steady sound. "He won't touch her," Wyatt said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a speech. He said it the way you state a fact about weather or ground, flatly, without decoration, because the decoration would have felt dishonest. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "You haven't changed," she said, and it didn't sound like a compliment or a criticism. It sounded like something she was genuinely uncertain whether to be relieved by. Lillian woke up around sundown and came to find them in the kitchen, her braid half fallen out and one cheek still creased from the pillow seam. She stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the 2 of them sitting on opposite sides of the table and said, with the directness that apparently came naturally to her, "Are you fighting?" "No," Wyatt said. "You both look like you've been fighting." "We've been talking," Eliza said. "There's a difference." Lillian looked skeptical. She came in and sat at the table in the same chair she'd used that morning, pulling her knees up to her chest in a way that made her look younger than the careful adult composure she wore most of the time. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. Wyatt glanced at Eliza. Eliza gave him the slight nod that meant, "Your call." He looked at Lillian. "Tomorrow I take you out to see the property. If you're going to stay here, you should know the land." Lillian uncurled slightly. "All of it?" "Whatever you want to see." She considered this with the seriousness of someone making a genuine strategic decision. Can I ride? Do you know how? A little, she said. Mama taught me on a borrowed horse, but the horse was old and slow. Mine aren't old, he said. We'll see about slow. Something happened to Lillian's face then, a small loosening, a brief brightness, before she pulled the careful composure back. But Wyatt had seen it. That second of just being a kid who was excited about horses. He held on to that because it was the first uncomplicated thing that had happened all day. Eliza made supper from what was in Wyatt's mostly inadequate larder. He was a functional cook, but not a stocking cook, meaning he always had enough for himself, but barely. And the three of them ate together in the kitchen in a silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. It was the silence of people who had too much to say any of it over a meal and were giving themselves the small mercy of just eating. Lillian ate everything on her plate and looked at the pan. There's more, Eliza said. Lillian helped herself without being asked, which told Wyatt she'd been hungry for a while before today. That thought sat in his gut like something cold. That night, after Lillian was back in bed and the lamps in the kitchen were low, Wyatt sat across from Eliza with the cloth envelope between them on the table. He hadn't opened it. He was looking at it. Open it, she said. He picked it up and opened it carefully and spread the documents out on the table. He looked at them for a long time. The forged letter, the one supposedly from him to her, telling her he'd made his decision, was the worst of it. Not because it was well made, though it was, because the person who'd written it had studied him, had captured something of the way he'd written in his 20s, the sentence structure, the particular rhythms, well enough that if he hadn't known it was false, he might have questioned himself. He might have sat there and thought, did I write this? Is this something I could have written? That was the specific obscenity of it. That Gideon Voss had studied them both closely enough to forge their most private correspondence convincingly. That their intimacy had been weaponized against them. Wyatt set the letter down. He pressed his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose and sat for a moment. Are you all right? Eliza asked. No, he said honestly, but I will be. He looked up. This is enough. This and the other documents. This is enough to expose him. In front of the right people, yes, she said, but getting in front of the right people is the problem. The land hearing next month, Voss is presenting his case for the federal appointment. It's a public proceeding. There will be people present with actual federal authority, not just county influence. You want to bring this to the hearing, Wyatt said. I want to end this at the hearing, she said, where he can't suppress it quietly, where there are people he can't buy or threaten fast enough. He'll know you're here before then, Wyatt said. Yes. Which means the next few weeks are going to be dangerous. Yes. He looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked at her. You planned this, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, and maybe something else underneath it. Something like, you came here not just because you were scared, but because you needed the hearing to be in this county to use this evidence, and this county is where I am, and you planned this carefully. Eliza met his look steadily. I came here because this is where I needed to be. To end it, yes, but also... She stopped, started again. Also because Lillian kept asking me for 2 years why she didn't have a father. And I ran out of ways to answer that without telling her the truth. And once I told her the truth, she looked at me and said, she's 11. And she said, then why aren't we going? Eliza's composure wavered for the first time since she'd arrived, a genuine crack in it before she steadied herself. A child shouldn't have more courage than her mother. The lamp between them guttered slightly in a draft from the ill-sealed window. Wyatt picked up the forged letter one more time. He looked at the handwriting that was almost his and not his. He thought about the version of himself who had received a letter like this and believed it, who had read it and broken and never fully healed in the particular place that breaking had happened. He thought about 12 years of cold mornings and coffee gone cold, and the specific loneliness of a man who had decided love was a thing that happened to him once. I'm going to need to tell a few people, he said. People I trust. If Voss comes here, which he will, I can't be the only one who knows what's happening. Who do you trust? He thought about it. Not long. He'd always been clear-eyed about people. My neighbor to the north, Frank Hollis. He's been in this county longer than Voss, and he doesn't owe Voss anything. And Deputy Agnes Pruitt in town. A woman deputy? The best one in the county, he said, and the only one in this county that Voss doesn't have a hold on, from what I can tell. Eliza nodded slowly. Okay, he said. He gathered the documents carefully back into the cloth envelope and handed it back to her. She looked at him when she took it, a look that asked a question she didn't put into words. Keep it with you, he said. Don't put it in a bag I can't watch. Don't leave it in a room you're not in. She tucked it into her coat, inside, close to her body. Wyatt, she said. Just his name again, the way she'd said it in the yard that morning. But different now. The armor had shifted. Don't, he said, not unkindly. Not tonight. There's too much, and tonight is just tonight. Let it be tonight. She closed her mouth, looked at the table, then she nodded. He poured the last of the coffee into both cups, even though it was late and neither of them needed it. They sat with it. Outside, the Montana dark was complete, and the stars were out in the way they only got in October, sharp and impossible. The kind of sky that made the world feel both enormous and close. The ranch was quiet. In the back room, his daughter was asleep for only the second time under his roof, a girl he hadn't known existed this morning, a girl who had his eyes and her mother's stubbornness and more courage at 11 years old than most people he'd ever known. Wyatt Callahan had survived a great many things. He had survived debt and drought, and a winter that had taken half the ranches in the county. He had survived the specific destruction of losing a person he'd built his entire future around, and the years of reconstruction that followed, and the particular hollowness of a life that worked but didn't sing. He had not, until this morning, understood that all of that surviving had been waiting for something. He wasn't ready to name what that something was. He was a practical man, not a sentimental one, and the last thing he needed was to read too much into a morning that had already overloaded every circuit he had. But sitting in his kitchen with cold coffee and a woman he had never stopped grieving for and the knowledge that a child slept in his back room, he felt, for the first time in years, something other than the dull, steady maintenance of a life held together by will alone. He felt the slight, terrifying electricity of a future that was not yet determined. And somewhere in the house, without him knowing it, Lillian had woken in the dark and lay listening to the quiet murmur of voices from the kitchen. Two people talking, and had stared at the ceiling with those gray-green eyes that were her father's eyes, and had felt, for the first time in her 11 years, the specific, unfamiliar warmth of being in a place that might, eventually, become something like home. She didn't say that. She didn't tell either of them. She was a child who had learned to be careful with hope, but she held on to it in the dark, the way you hold something fragile when you're not yet sure it won't break. The next morning came cold and clear and brought with it the small ordinary shock of Wyatt Callahan waking up to sounds in his kitchen. He lay in bed for a moment before he understood what he was hearing. Movement. The stove being fed. A cabinet opened and closed. Two voices, one low and one higher. He had lived alone for so long that the sounds of other people in his house had the quality of something half-dreamed. He dressed and came out and found Lillian standing at his stove with a focused expression, supervised by Eliza, who was clearly letting her do the thing herself despite obvious reservations. The pan had eggs in it that were starting to get away from Lillian in terms of temperature. "Hotter than you think," Wyatt said from the doorway. Lillian startled. "I know. You're going to scramble them whether you mean to or not. I want fried." "Then move the pan." She moved the pan. The eggs settled. She looked over her shoulder at him with an expression that was 70% annoyance and 30% satisfaction, which was an expression he was fairly certain he himself made regularly. He looked at Eliza over Lillian's head. Eliza was watching him with something that was difficult to name. It wasn't hope exactly, and it wasn't grief exactly, but it lived in the neighborhood of both. He looked away before either of them had to do anything with it. He poured his own coffee and sat at the table, and Lillian presented the eggs 10 minutes later with the ceremony of someone who was aware they hadn't quite achieved what they were aiming for, but was going to present it with dignity regardless. They were slightly overdone on one side. "They're good," Wyatt said. "Don't be nice," she said. I'll know when I get them right. He looked at her. All right, he said. The left side needs another 30 seconds and you move the pan too many times. You want them to sit. She nodded. She was already filing this information away. He could see it happening on her face. Not defensive, absorbing. It was, he thought, the strangest and most ordinary morning of his life. And then Frank Hollis's horse came up the road at a pace that meant something was wrong, and ordinary ended before it had properly started. Wyatt was already standing when Frank dismounted, before the man had said a word, because a man who'd ranched next to someone for 11 years learned to read the set of their body from 50 yards. Frank Hollis was 62 years old, weathered into someone who resembled a piece of old timber, solid and gray and not easy to alarm. He was alarmed now. He looked past Wyatt to the house, to the carriage still sitting in the yard from yesterday, and then back at Wyatt with an expression that managed to be both a question and a warning at the same time. Gideon Voss, Frank said, breathing a little hard from riding fast, was at the Harlan's Creek telegraph office when I came through town this morning, sending messages. 3 of them, one right after the other. Wyatt went still. I know the clerk, Frank continued, lowering his voice though they were alone in the yard. She couldn't read what he sent, but the way he was sending them, fast, private, didn't want anyone near him. That's not a man tying up routine business. Wyatt looked back at the house. Through the window he could see the shape of Eliza at the kitchen table. How long ago? He asked. 2 hours, Frank said. Maybe less. 2 hours, which meant responses could start coming back by afternoon, which meant whatever Voss had set in motion this morning was already in motion. Frank, Wyatt said, I need to tell you something, and then I need your help. Frank Hollis looked at him steadily. Then tell me, he said. I got all morning. It was almost exactly what Wyatt had said to Eliza in the barn yesterday. And standing there in the cold, clear October light, with a daughter he hadn't known he had sleeping under his roof, and a man he'd trusted for 11 years standing in front of him, and Gideon Voss already moving somewhere in the county like a storm forming at the edge of the sky, Wyatt Callahan understood that the weeks ahead were going to require everything he had. Not just strength, not just stubbornness, not just the hard-won endurance of a man who knew how to survive a bad season. Something harder than any of that. He began to talk. Frank Hollis listened the way he did everything, without interruption, without visible reaction, his eyes steady and his hands quiet at his sides. Wyatt told him all of it standing in the yard because it didn't feel like a conversation to have indoors. Not yet. Not while he was still sorting through what it meant to say it out loud to someone outside the 3 people who already knew. He told Frank about Eliza, about the 12 years, about the letters, about Lillian. Frank's expression didn't shift much through most of it. He was not a man given to dramatic reactions, but when Wyatt got to Lillian, when he said the words, "She's my daughter," Frank looked down at the ground for a moment, the way men of his generation did when something hit them somewhere too real for their face to stay neutral. When Wyatt finished, Frank was quiet for a beat. Then he said, 11 years. 11 years and 4 months, Wyatt said, and he heard the echo of Lillian's precise correction in his own voice, and something painful moved through him. Frank nodded slowly. He looked at the carriage. He looked at the house. He looked back at Wyatt. What do you need from me? He said. Not what can I do with the vague generosity of someone offering help they don't mean to follow through on. What do you need? Specific. Committed. Eyes on the eastern road, Wyatt said. Your property line sits closer to the main approach from town than mine does. If anyone comes, anyone who looks like they're coming with purpose rather than passing through, I need to know before they reach my gate. Done, Frank said. What else? Agnes Pruitt, Wyatt said. Can you get word to her without going through the main office? Frank considered. I see her Sunday mornings at the feed store. She picks up supplies for the week. This can't wait until Sunday. I know where she lives, Frank said. I'll ride over this afternoon. Wyatt nodded. Tell her I need to talk to her. Tell her it concerns Voss. She'll understand why it can't go through the regular channels. Frank straightened and pulled his coat tighter against the morning cold. He was already turning toward his horse, already converting the conversation into action the way practical men did. Not because they lacked feeling, but because action was how they handled feeling. "Wyatt," he said, one foot in the stirrup. "Yeah." "The girl," Frank said. He paused, seeming to weigh the words. "She looked like you?" Wyatt looked at the house. "Yeah," he said. "She does." Frank nodded once, as if that settled something. He mounted and rode north. Wyatt came back inside to find that Eliza had heard the horse arrive and had been watching from the window. She stood with her arms crossed, not defensively, but the way people cross their arms when they're cold and trying to hold their own warmth. "Frank Hollis," Wyatt told her. "He saw Voss at the telegraph office this morning." The color in her face didn't drain exactly. It was more like her expression went from careful to very still. "How long do we have?" she asked. Same question as last night. "Less than we thought," he said. "Probably." Lillian was at the kitchen table with a cup of something warm, listening to this exchange with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that the right to be present in adult conversations has to be earned by not making adults regret letting you hear things. She'd learned it young. It made Wyatt's chest ache in a low, constant way. "I need to know about the hearing," he said to Eliza. "The exact date, who convenes it, who has authority in the room." Eliza sat down. "November 14th, 3 weeks out. It's a Federal Land Administration hearing. Voss is presenting his bid for the regional commissioner's appointment. The presiding official is a man named Hargrove, sent from the territorial capital. He has actual federal backing, not county authority." She looked at her hands. "That's why the timing matters. Voss can't suppress a federal official. He can delay, he can complicate, but he cannot make Hargrove disappear the way he's made county judges disappear." 3 weeks, Wyatt said. 3 weeks, she confirmed. He sat down across from her. Lillian looked between them. "That means he's going to move fast," Wyatt said. "He can't let you get to that hearing. Everything he does between now and November 14th is going to be about making sure you don't walk into that room." "I know," Eliza said. "He'll come at your reputation first. He'll put out a version of events that makes you look unstable, vindictive. A woman with a grudge who disappeared for 12 years and suddenly showed up with stories." "I know," she said again, and the flatness in it meant she'd already thought through all of this, probably many times, probably in the dark of whatever rented rooms she'd lived in over the years. "And if that doesn't work," Wyatt said, "he'll try something else." Eliza looked up. "He already has." Wyatt waited. "The man who came to my school with the note," she said, "he wasn't just delivering a message. He told me, casually, like it was information being shared as a courtesy, that there was a legal question about Lillian's parentage, about whether a child born to an unwed woman with no documented father had the same standing as other children in certain situations. He said a man of means who believed himself to be the child's guardian figure, having supported the mother's relocation years ago." She stopped. Wyatt's jaw went tight. "He's claiming he supported you?" "He's building a story," she said quietly. "He's been building it for longer than I knew. The way he always builds things, slowly, with paperwork, with the testimony of people who owe him. By the time I understood what he was constructing, it was already partially built." Lillian set her cup down with a small, careful sound. "He's trying to say he has claim over me," she said. Not a question. She'd understood. Eliza looked at her daughter. "Yes." Lillian's face did something complicated, a rapid sequence of emotions moving through it too fast to name, anger and fear, and something hard underneath both. Then she went very still. "He doesn't," she said. "No," Wyatt said. "He doesn't." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd looked at him in the yard yesterday, that measuring, careful assessment. Then she nodded once, as if something had been confirmed, and picked her cup back up and said nothing more. But the set of her jaw was her mother's, and the steadiness of her eyes was his, and looking at her in that moment, Wyatt felt something that he recognized distantly as fury, clean and purposeful, the kind that doesn't waste itself on noise. He rode to town that afternoon alone. telling Eliza to keep the doors latched and to not answer for anyone she didn't recognize. She accepted this without argument, which told him she understood the shift that had happened overnight. They were no longer in a period of uncertainty. They were in a period of specific threat. Harlan's Creek on a Tuesday afternoon was the way small frontier towns always were, functional and unhurried on the surface, with the current of local politics running underneath everything like cold water under ice. People knew each other's business here. They had for generations. Wyatt had lived in this county long enough to know who talked to whom and what information traveled which way. He went to the feed store first because it was the most legitimate reason to be in town. He needed supplies, and he was going to need more in the next few weeks than usual, and nobody questioned a man loading up his wagon. He was working through his list when he felt the change in the room. Conversations didn't stop exactly. They just shifted register, a slight drop in volume, a reorientation of bodies. The kind of thing that happened when someone entered a space who commanded attention without asking for it. Wyatt turned slowly. Gideon Voss was standing in the doorway of the feed store. He was 50 years old and looked 5 years younger, which was the particular injustice of men who'd spent their lives in power rather than labor. He was tall, well-dressed in the manner of a man who was always aware of how he appeared, with silver at his temples and a face that had learned to arrange itself into expressions of reasonable authority. He wasn't a physically intimidating man. He didn't need to be. His power had always worked through structure, through ownership and debt and influence, and the carefully maintained knowledge that he could make things difficult for anyone who crossed him. He looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man who had expected this encounter and had prepared for it. "Callahan," he said pleasantly, "I heard you had some visitors." The feed store was not empty. Wyatt was aware of exactly how many people were in the room. "Voss," he said. He turned back to his list deliberately. "I've got what I came for." "That's a long drive for feed," Voss said, coming a few steps into the store. "Most men don't make it on a Tuesday. Takes planning." "I plan ahead," Wyatt said. Voss picked up a tin of something from the shelf nearest him and looked at it with the studied casualness of a man who had rehearsed exactly how casual he was going to appear. "I was sorry to hear about the woman," he said. "Eliza Monroe. Knew her family years ago, of course. Troubled girl, made some difficult choices. I imagine seeing her again after all this time was surprising." Wyatt set his list on the counter and looked at Voss directly for the first time. "That's an interesting way to describe it," he said. Voss set the tin down. "I'm only saying, a woman who disappeared for 12 years and then turns up with a child and a story, well, people will naturally wonder about her circumstances, about her stability." A slight pause. "About the child's situation." The store was very quiet. "The child's situation," Wyatt said, keeping his voice even, "is that she's with her family." Something moved through Voss's expression. Not surprise, he was too controlled for surprise, but a recalibration. He'd expected deflection or anger. He'd gotten a statement of fact delivered without heat, and he was reassessing. "Of course," Voss said smoothly. "Well, I hope things settle well for everyone involved." He smiled, the smile of a man who had been smiling at people from positions of power for so long that it had become entirely detached from anything resembling warmth. "It's a complicated situation. These things often are." He left. The room exhaled. The man behind the counter, Jessup Hale, who had run the feed store for 20 years, and who Wyatt had known for most of them, looked at Wyatt with an expression that was part concern and part something else. Not disapproval, more like the look of a man who had just watched a storm front arrive. "He was at the telegraph office this morning," Jessup said quietly. "I heard," Wyatt said. "3 messages, one right after the other." Jessup leaned on the counter. "I don't know what was in them, but I know the look on a man's face when he's calling in resources." He paused. "You be careful, Wyatt." Wyatt paid for his supplies. On his way out of the store, he passed 2 women he recognized from town who stopped their conversation and watched him with the particular attention people give to situations they've heard about but don't yet fully understand. The story was already moving. Voss had made sure of that. By tonight, half the county would have some version of it, carefully shaped, strategically incomplete. He loaded the wagon and drove back toward the ranch. His hands were steady on the reins. His mind was working fast and cold, the way it did in situations where feeling things had to wait. Voss had come to the feed store not to threaten him. He'd come to establish a public version of events in front of witnesses, to plant the seeds of doubt, to make sure that when Eliza's evidence came out, there was already a counter-narrative in place, a man of reasonable bearing who expressed only concern versus an unstable woman with a grudge and a questionable child. It was how Voss had always operated. Not through force, through narrative. Wyatt had understood this intellectually before. Seeing it in action, feeling the subtle pressure of it in a room full of people he'd known for years, that was different. That was the specific cold fury of watching a sophisticated machinery grind toward the people you were protecting, and knowing that hitting it directly would only get you caught in its gears. He needed something else. He needed Agnes Pruitt. She came to the ranch 2 days later at dusk, riding alone the way she always moved, efficiently, without announcement. Agnes Pruitt was 44 years old and had been a deputy in Harlan's Creek for 9 years, which was 9 years longer than anyone had expected when she'd applied, and she'd earned every day of it through a combination of relentless competence and the particular skill of making powerful men underestimate her right up until the moment it was too late. She was not friends with Gideon Voss. She was not an enemy of his either, at least not publicly. She was too smart for that. But she had made it her business over 9 years to stay out of his network of obligations, which meant she was one of the few people in the county who answered only to her own conscience and the actual law. She dismounted in Wyatt's yard and looked at the carriage that was still there, and then at Wyatt, who had come out to meet her. "Frank said it was about Voss," she said. "Frank doesn't rattle easy." He sounded rattled. "Come inside," Wyatt said. He introduced her to Eliza and Lillian in the kitchen. Agnes looked at Lillian for a brief moment with the assessing look of someone trained to notice things, and then she looked at Wyatt, and something in her expression confirmed what was already obvious to anyone paying attention. She sat down and Eliza spread the documents on the table. Agnes went through them slowly. She was not a fast reader. She was a thorough one. She picked up the forged letter last and held it at the angle where the lamp hit it best, and looked at it for a long time. "The paper," she said finally. "What about it?" Eliza said. "It's county procurement stock." She set it down carefully. "I'd recognize it anywhere. The county office used this exact weight and color for 4 years, 1873 to 1877. Anyone ordering supplies through the county commissioner's office would have access to it." Eliza stared at her. "I knew the handwriting was forged. I didn't know the paper had its own signature." "Most people wouldn't," Agnes said. "But I spent 2 years working supply inventory before I moved to deputy work. Tedious work has its uses." She looked at the other documents. "This one?" She indicated the letter in Voss's own hand from the county records. "Combined with this and the former clerk's statement, if we can get it in an admissible form, and the testimony of the housekeeper." "The housekeeper moved north," Eliza said. "I don't know if she'd come back." "What's her name?" Agnes said. "Clara Bright. She was in Billings last I heard. That was 2 years ago." Agnes pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and wrote the name down. "I'm going to ask you something," Agnes said, looking up at Eliza directly. "And I need a straight answer because what I do next depends on it. Is there anything in your history, anything at all, that Voss could use to discredit you? Not morally, legally. Anything that could be represented as instability, fraud, abandonment of responsibility?" Eliza didn't look away. "I left the county without formal notice. That's all he has. I didn't break any law." "You left an intended marriage." "There was no legal contract," Eliza said. "We were 2 people planning to marry. Nothing formal had been filed." Agnes nodded slowly. "And Lillian?" She glanced at the girl who was listening with that familiar, careful stillness. "The father is documented nowhere." "Nowhere," Eliza confirmed. Agnes looked at Wyatt. "We can change that," Wyatt said, "if there's a legal process." "There is," Agnes said. "It's not quick, but it can be started." An acknowledgement of paternity filed with the right office becomes a matter of public record. It makes Voss's claim to any kind of guardianship authority, however he's been building it, legally absurd. She paused. He'd have to challenge it openly, in a proceeding where the forged letters would become directly relevant. He'd be forcing his own exposure, Eliza said slowly. If he challenged it, yes. Agnes tapped the notebook against her palm. But I wouldn't count on him being that stupid. He's going to look for another angle first. What angle? Wyatt asked. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Your water rights, she said. He's been the commissioner overseeing the survey on the eastern section of your property line for the past 2 years. There's a designation question that's been sitting in his office. I've seen the file come through. He's been sitting on it. Wyatt went still. He's been holding my water rights designation in his office. Pending review, Agnes said, which is technically legal because the Eastern Survey has a legitimate boundary question. But the fact that it's been sitting for 2 years without movement... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Wyatt understood. The water rights on the eastern section fed the lower half of his grazing land. Without them formalized, he had a property that functioned but couldn't expand, couldn't be sold at full value, and, if Voss chose to exercise his commissioner's authority aggressively, could potentially face challenge to existing use. Voss hadn't used it yet because he hadn't needed to. He'd been keeping it in reserve, a lever to pull if something happened that required leverage. Like Eliza showing up with 12 years of evidence. He came to the feed store 2 days ago, Wyatt said. Introduced the idea of Eliza as a troubled woman. Started the narrative. Agnes looked unsurprised. That's step 1. Step 2 will be the water rights, a formal notice of review, probably within the week. It'll look like routine administrative action. It'll put you on the defensive, make you spend time and money responding to it. Meanwhile, step 3 is making Eliza appear to have an ulterior motive for being here. She came because you have financial troubles. She's using the situation. Her evidence is part of a scheme rather than the truth. The 3 adults in the room were quiet. Lillian said from her seat at the edge of the table, He's going to do all of that at the same time. They looked at her. She wasn't asking. She was following the logic. So that you're each fighting something different and can't focus on one thing long enough to win it. Agnes looked at the girl with an expression that moved from assessment to something close to respect. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. Lillian looked at Wyatt. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that didn't have a name yet. It was too early for that. But it was real. Then we do the same, Lillian said. We do things at the same time, too. That was the conversation that changed the shape of the next 3 weeks. Not because an 11-year-old had solved it. She hadn't, not exactly. But because hearing it stated plainly by someone without history or investment in the complexity of it cut through to the actual strategy. Voss's power was in managing multiple fronts simultaneously and keeping his targets reacting instead of acting. The answer was not to be faster. The answer was to build a structure that moved on all fronts at once, without requiring any single person to carry the whole weight. Agnes would work the Clara Bright angle. She had channels through the deputy network that went beyond county borders. She would also monitor the water rights file through official channels, which she had legitimate access to, and the moment a formal notice of review was filed, she would have it in front of the right people before Voss expected. Frank Hollis agreed to approach 2 other long-standing ranchers in the county, men who had their own quiet reasons to want Voss's authority checked, men who had never been willing to move alone but might move as part of something, not for confrontation, for presence at the hearing. Bodies in a room mattered. An audience of people with standing in the community mattered. Wyatt would handle the paternity filing. Agnes told him the office, told him the form, told him which clerk, a young woman named Ruth Eller, relatively new to the county and therefore not yet embedded in Voss's network of favors, to file it with. He would do it quietly and without announcement, but once it was filed, it was a public document, and a public document had its own kind of protection. Eliza would keep the evidence close and begin drafting a formal account, a written narrative of events, signed and dated, that could be entered into the federal hearing record. Not inflammatory. Precise. The language of fact rather than grievance, because grievance could be dismissed and fact could not. They mapped all of this out at Wyatt's kitchen table while the lamp burned down, and Lillian fell asleep sitting up in her chair without anyone noticing until Eliza put a hand on her shoulder and she startled awake, immediately embarrassed. "Go to bed," Wyatt told her. Not unkindly. "I'm not tired," she said, and was asleep again within 4 minutes of lying down. Agnes left near midnight. Before she mounted, she stood with Wyatt for a moment in the yard. "He's going to escalate," she said quietly. "When the narrative doesn't move fast enough and the filing appears in the record, he's going to escalate. I want you to be ready for that. Not just legally, physically ready." "I've been ready for that since the morning she showed up," Wyatt said. Agnes nodded. She looked toward the house. "That girl," she said. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "Does she understand what's at stake?" "Better than most adults," he said. Agnes mounted. "Then don't underestimate what that is," she said. "A child who's been paying attention to hard things is a different kind of strong. Don't protect her past the point where she stops being useful to herself." She rode into the dark. Wyatt stood in the yard for a moment after the sound of her horse faded. The cold had a real bite to it now. They were deep enough into October that it didn't apologize for itself anymore. He went inside. The house was quiet. Both of them, Eliza in the small second room he'd hurriedly made habitable with a proper cot 2 nights ago, and Lillian in the back room on the old mattress, were asleep. He could tell by the quality of the quiet. He sat at the kitchen table alone and looked at the cold lamp. 3 weeks to November 14th. He thought about Voss in the feed store. The pleasantness of the man, the way he'd used the words troubled girl and complicated situation with the ease of someone who had been grooming a public perception for years, not days. The architecture of what Voss had built against Eliza wasn't impulsive or reactive. It was patient. It had been there, waiting to be deployed for over a decade. That was the particular horror of it, not the moment of deception 12 years ago. The ongoing maintenance of it, the slow, quiet effort to keep 2 people apart, to keep the truth suppressed, to keep his own story intact. For years and years, while Wyatt had worked alone and Eliza had survived alone, and Lillian had grown up half a life short of what she should have had, Gideon Voss had been tending the lie like a garden. The specific fury of that, not hot, not loud, but very cold and very precise, settled into Wyatt's chest and didn't leave. He was not a man who hated easily. He'd learned young that hate was expensive and impractical and made bad decisions. He'd spent most of his adult life avoiding it, even in situations that might have warranted it. But sitting at his own table, in the house he'd built alone because he'd had no reason to build anything else, thinking about 12 years of Gideon Voss's patient, deliberate damage, he let himself feel the full weight of it, just for a moment, just long enough to know exactly what he was fighting for. Then he put it away. He went to bed. Outside, somewhere to the east, the wind shifted. The kind of shift that meant the weather was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The formal notice of water rights review arrived 4 days later, exactly as Agnes had predicted. It came through official channels, delivered by a county rider, stamped with Voss's commissioner's seal. The language was bureaucratic and impersonal, a standard review of eastern boundary water allocation pending resurvey. And if Wyatt hadn't known what he was looking at, it might have appeared exactly as advertised. He brought it to Agnes. She had it in front of Ruth Eller at the county clerk's office by that afternoon, alongside a formal response contesting the timeline of the review and requesting federal oversight of the process on the basis of the pending hearing. It was a small move, a defensive one, but it put the process on record in a way that Voss hadn't intended to allow this early, and it signaled, to Voss and to anyone watching, that this time the other side had done its homework. Eliza was writing when Wyatt came back from town that day. She'd set herself up at the corner of the kitchen table with the careful, organized neatness of a woman who had learned to work in small spaces. The document spread to her left and a growing stack of handwritten pages to her right. She was focused in a way that closed her off from the room. He recognized it, had seen it when they were young, the way she went somewhere internal when something required her full precision. He didn't interrupt her. Lillian was outside. He found her at the fence line of the near pasture, watching his horses with the focused attention of someone running calculations. She'd been out there 20 minutes at least, from what he could tell, just watching them move. He came and leaned on the fence beside her. "The gray one's faster," she said, not looking at him. "But the bay is smarter. You can tell because the gray does what it wants, and the bay watches where it's going." Wyatt looked at his horses. She was right. "The gray's name is Seven," he said, "because she was the 7th horse I ever owned, and I'd run out of names by then." "That's a terrible name," Lillian said. "She doesn't seem to mind." Lillian almost smiled. Not quite, but close. They stood at the fence for a while without talking. The afternoon was cold and clear, the sky the particular high bright blue of late October in Montana, the kind that looked warmer than it was. "My mother's scared," Lillian said, still looking at the horses. "She's being careful," Wyatt said. "There's a difference." "She doesn't sleep well," Lillian said. "She never has, but it's worse here. She thinks I don't notice." A pause. "I always notice." Wyatt looked at the side of her face, the set of her jaw, the way she stated things plainly without asking for anything in return. Not comfort, not reassurance, just the fact, placed between them. "I know," he said. "Are we going to be all right?" she asked. And there it was. The 11-year-old under the careful, composed surface, asking the question she'd been not asking since they arrived. He thought about lying. Not for long. He wasn't a man who lied to people to make them feel better. And he had a feeling that Lillian, who had been reading adults her whole life out of necessity, would spot it in a second and like him less for it. "I don't know for certain," he said. "What I know is that we're not alone in this and we're not going in unprepared. That's different from the situation your mother's been in." Lillian considered this. "Different because of you?" she said. "Different because of all of it," he said. "Agnes Pruitt, Frank Hollis, the evidence your mother kept. All of it together." He paused. "But yes, partly me." She finally turned and looked at him, that direct gray-green gaze that he was getting more used to, but that still carried a small charge every time. The recognition of something that was his, looking back at him. "She didn't know if you'd help," Lillian said. "When we were coming, on the train, she didn't know if you'd turn us away." "She said that?" "She didn't have to," Lillian said. "I could tell she was preparing herself for that. She does this thing when she's preparing for something to go wrong. She gets very quiet and she sits up straight. She was like that the whole way here." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I wouldn't have turned you away," he said. "I know that now," Lillian said. "I'm just telling you she didn't." He nodded. He understood what she was telling him, not as a criticism, but as information. Eliza had come here not knowing if the man she'd been separated from for 12 years had enough left to want to know her, to want to know their daughter. She'd come anyway. That was what courage actually looked like, and Lillian wanted him to understand the cost of it. "She's braver than she gives herself credit for," Wyatt said. "Yes," Lillian said. "She is." A gust of wind came off the ridge and Lillian tucked her chin into her collar. She looked back at the horses. Seven was doing something complicated in the far corner of the pasture that involved nudging the bay with her shoulder, and the bay was enduring it with the patient expression of someone accustomed to unreasonable companions. "Tomorrow," Wyatt said, "if it's not too cold, I'll take you out on the bay. Properly. Not a short loop. A real ride." Lillian turned to look at him with the now familiar sequence. Careful assessment, brief brightness, pulled back composure. But this time, she let the brightness stay a moment longer before she reined it in. "Okay," she said. They walked back to the house together. The sky had gone gold and pink at the edges, the sun dropping fast the way it did in October. The good light brief and not apologetic about it. The ranch was exactly as it always was. The same fence posts and same barn and same stretch of open land that Wyatt had walked alone for 12 years. He'd been over every inch of it so many times it had long ago stopped looking like anything except work. Walking it now with a child beside him who had his eyes and her mother's stubbornness, it looked like something else entirely. He didn't say that. He wasn't built for saying things like that, but he thought it. And somewhere in the kitchen, Eliza set down her pen and pressed her fingers to her eyes and breathed and then picked the pen back up and kept writing, because the hearing was 3 weeks away, and the truth needed to be on paper, and she was the only one who could put it there, and she was not going to stop until it was done. The paternity filing went through on a Thursday. Wyatt had driven into town alone, early, before the county offices filled with the usual morning traffic. Ruth Eller was at her desk when he arrived, a young woman with ink-stained fingers and the efficient manner of someone who had decided to be good at a job that most people underestimated. He set the completed form on her desk without preamble and explained what it was. She read it carefully. She looked up at him once, briefly, with an expression that was professional and contained, and then she stamped it and entered it into the record book and handed him his copy. "Filed," she said. "As of today." "Thank you," he said. "Mr. Callahan." She said it quietly, leaning slightly forward. "The Commissioner's office receives a daily summary of filings." He nodded. He'd expected that. "It'll be in tomorrow's summary," she said. "I know," he said. "That's fine." He walked out of the county office into the cold morning and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment with his copy of the filing folded in his coat pocket. He'd just done something that couldn't be undone. In the territorial records, Lillian Monroe was now Lillian Monroe Callahan, with a documented father and a legal standing that hadn't existed yesterday. He thought about how it would feel to Lillian when he told her. He thought about Eliza's face when she heard. Then he thought about Gideon Voss reading the daily summary tomorrow morning. He got in his wagon and drove back to the ranch. He told them that evening at supper. Eliza's fork stopped moving. She set it down on the edge of her plate with the careful deliberateness of someone buying themselves a second before they had to respond. Lillian said, "You did that today?" "This morning," he said. Lillian looked at her plate. Then she looked up. Something moved through her face that she didn't try to control. It was too large for her usual composure to contain, and for a moment she was fully and completely a child who had just been given something she hadn't known how much she needed. Her eyes went bright, and she pressed her lips together hard. She didn't cry. She didn't say thank you. She picked up her fork and went back to eating, but her chin was doing something effortful, and Wyatt looked away to give her the privacy of it. Eliza was looking at him. "You didn't tell me you were going to do it today," she said. "No," he said. "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I didn't want to have a conversation about whether to do it," he said. "It needed doing, so I did it." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "He'll know by tomorrow." "Yes." "That changes the timeline of how he moves." "It might speed it up," Wyatt said, "or it might force his hand in a direction we can actually use. Agnes thinks the latter." Eliza picked her fork back up. She didn't say anything else about it, but when Lillian got up after supper to help clear the plates, something she'd started doing 3 days in, without being asked, in the quiet way she adopted habits once she'd decided a place was worth committing to, Eliza reached out and put her hand briefly on Wyatt's forearm where it rested on the table. Not a long touch. Not a dramatic one. The length of a breath. She took her hand back and went to help with the dishes. Wyatt sat at the table and looked at the place where her hand had been and felt 12 years and 3 feet of kitchen table and approximately 10,000 things he didn't know how to say all at the same time. He got up and went to check the horses. "What?" Voss's response came not the next day but the day after, and it didn't come through official channels. It came through a man named Cutter Brassa. Wyatt knew the name but not the man well. Brassa was a property agent who worked the county and surrounding territories, the kind of man who existed in the fluid space between legitimate business and whoever was currently paying him the most. He arrived at the ranch mid-morning while Wyatt was in the barn and knocked on the house door, and Eliza, who had been warned never to open for strangers, watched him from the window until he gave up and walked toward the barn. Wyatt heard him coming and stepped out. Brass was a compact man in his 40s with a friendly face that had learned to do professional work. He smiled at Wyatt with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being received with suspicion and having to work through it. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I represent a buyer interested in your eastern section. Understood there's a survey question currently under review. My client is prepared to make an offer that would resolve the question quickly and cleanly for both parties." Wyatt looked at him. "Your client," Wyatt said. "A land investment concern," Brassa said pleasantly. I'm not at liberty to... Brasa, Wyatt said. I've been ranching this county for 15 years. I know whose investment concern you work for when you show up the day after a water rights filing and the day after a paternity document gets entered into the county record. So let's not do the part where you pretend you're here about property. Brasa's friendly expression didn't crack exactly. It shifted, the smile staying in place but going slightly hollow. He was recalculating. My client, he said carefully, believes a negotiated resolution would benefit everyone. The survey question creates instability for your properties long term. Tell your client, Wyatt said, that the eastern section isn't for sale. The water rights aren't in question, and the only resolution that interests me is the one happening in front of a federal official at the land hearing on November 14th. The hollow smile finally dropped. Brasa looked at him with something more honest. Not anger, more like the expression of a man who had delivered a message he already knew the answer to and was now just completing the formality. He expected you'd say that, Brasa said. Then he didn't need to send you, Wyatt said. Brasa nodded slowly. He looked around the yard, the house, the barn, the land, with an appraising eye that wasn't about the property, and both of them knew it. Then he turned and walked back toward his horse. At the gate he paused. Mr. Callahan, he said, without turning around. A man who spent 30 years building something doesn't walk away from it easily. Neither does a man who spent 30 years protecting it. A pause. Think about what you're protecting. Think about whether it's worth the cost of what's coming. He rode away. Wyatt stood in the yard until he was gone. Then he went inside and found Eliza standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed and her face very controlled. I heard most of it, she said. Good, he said. Then I don't have to repeat it. He's done with subtle, she said. He was never comfortable with subtle, Wyatt said. He just used it when he had time. He doesn't think he has time anymore. Eliza uncrossed her arms. She looked at the table, at the growing stack of her handwritten pages, the careful, documented account that was now 9 days of work and nearly complete. I need 3 more days to finish the written account, she said. Maybe 4. You have 11 days until the hearing, he said. I know the count, she said, with an edge that wasn't quite irritation but was close to it. The edge of someone running on less sleep than they needed and more pressure than they wanted. Eliza. What? Sit down. She looked at him. He pulled out the chair across from the one he was about to take. She sat, reluctantly, the way she sat when she thought sitting down was a luxury she couldn't afford. He sat across from her. Clara Bright, he said. Has Agnes heard anything? Eliza's expression shifted from pressured to something more complicated. She found her, she said, in Billings. Clara is... She's willing. Agnes spoke to her 2 days ago. And you didn't tell me. Eliza looked down at the table. I was going to. I was trying to determine how much weight her testimony actually carries before I... Eliza. He waited until she looked up. We're not doing this separately anymore. Whatever you know, I know. Whatever I know, you know. That's how this works now. She was quiet. I've been managing things alone for 12 years, she said. That's a hard habit to stop. I know, he said. I understand that. But you're not alone now, and operating like you are is going to create gaps that Voss can use. He kept his voice even. This wasn't a criticism. He genuinely understood it. 12 years of being her only resource had made her self-contained in ways that were both extraordinary and, right now, a liability. We have 11 days. We can't afford gaps. She looked at him for a moment. Something behind her eyes did the thing it did sometimes, a brief opening, like a window, before she closed it again deliberately. Clara will come, she said. She'll be here by November 10th. She has documentation of her own, records she kept from her time working for Voss. Agnes said it corroborates the timeline of what he did. That's 3 sources at the hearing, Wyatt said. Your account, Claire's documentation, and the physical evidence. Plus Agnes as the legal witness to the chain of custody on the documents, Eliza said. Plus Frank and the other ranchers as public presence, Wyatt said. Voss is going to walk into that room expecting a manageable situation We need to make sure that when he sees what's actually in that room, it's too late for him to recalibrate." Eliza nodded. She reached up and pressed her fingers briefly to her temple in the gesture she made when she was tired but hadn't decided to admit it yet. "I'm going to finish the account tonight," she said. "Tonight you're going to sleep," he said. "Wyatt, the account doesn't change in quality if you write it exhausted versus rested," he said. "You know that. You're a precise person. Precision requires sleep." She opened her mouth, closed it. "That's annoying," she said, "when you're right and you say it like that." "I know," he said. For a moment, just a moment, the 12 years of weight between them lifted slightly, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at him when they were young, with the particular expression that meant he'd gotten past the armor without her planning to let him. Then it settled back into place, gentler than before. She went to bed at 9 o'clock. He sat at the table and made a list of everything that still needed to happen in 11 days, and then he made another list of everything that could go wrong. And he worked through both lists methodically until the lamp needed refilling. And then he refilled it and kept working until the cold, deepest part of the night, when the ranch went so quiet he could hear the horses shifting in the barn. But 3 days before the hearing, everything almost fell apart. It started with Frank Hollis riding in at a pace that meant emergency, which was the second time in 3 weeks that Wyatt had seen that particular pace, and it didn't get easier to see. Frank dismounted and didn't bother with greeting. "The clerk," he said. "Ruth Eller." Wyatt felt something go cold in his chest. "What happened?" "She didn't get hurt," Frank said quickly. "She's all right. But someone went through the county office last night, ransacked the records room. Her desk was turned out." He paused, breathing hard from the ride. "The record book for the week of your filing was removed, the page with the entry." Wyatt was already moving toward the house. He came in and found Eliza at the table with Clara Bright, who had arrived the previous day, a woman in her 50s, small and deliberate in her movements, with the contained manner of someone who had spent years being invisible in powerful men's houses and had used that invisibility to see everything. They were going through documents together when Wyatt came in. He told them what Frank had said. Clara looked up. "The record page," she said. "Gone," Wyatt said. "Does he have a copy?" Eliza asked. "I have the copy Ruth gave me when I filed," Wyatt said. He was already going for the box where he kept his documents, in the corner of the kitchen that Eliza had started calling, without irony, the war room. He found it. It was there. He set it on the table. The three of them looked at it. "A copy isn't the same as the original record," Eliza said carefully. "No," Wyatt said. "But Agnes—" He stopped. He went to the window and looked out at Frank, who was still in the yard. He opened the door. "Frank," he said. "Get Agnes. Now." Frank nodded and mounted without needing more than that. Clara was looking at the copy of the filing on the table. "A removed record page is itself evidence," she said quietly. "It has a number sequence. The absence of that page in a numbered record book is documented by the numbers that surround the gap." Eliza looked at her. "You know about records documentation." "I lived in that man's house for 4 years," Clara said. "I watched him operate. I learned how records worked because he used records the way other men use weapons. I paid attention." She looked at Wyatt. "The numbered sequence in the record book, whoever took that page likely didn't know enough about how county record books are structured to know it would leave a traceable gap. Or they knew and didn't care because they planned to address the book itself." "He can't make the whole record book disappear," Wyatt said. "No," Clara said. "But he can delay a challenge to its integrity long enough to get past the hearing." Wyatt stood at the window looking out at the yard. 11 years of this man operating at the edge of the law, just inside the line where legitimate authority could reach him. Every move designed to be difficult to challenge directly. Every action wrapped in enough procedural legitimacy that fighting it required as much effort as the fight itself. Agnes arrived within 2 hours of Frank's ride. She came in and looked at the filing copy and looked at Wyatt and looked at the group assembled at his kitchen table. Himself, Eliza, Clara, Frank, who had come back in from the barn. and she pulled up a chair with the air of someone who had been running calculations since Frank reached her door. "The record book," she said. "I can request an official audit of the records room through the deputy office. We received a report of a break-in, which means I have legitimate cause. The audit will document the gap in the numbered sequence." "Can you get it done before the hearing?" Wyatt asked. "If I start today," she said. "Maybe." "What does maybe mean?" Eliza asked. "It means the county recorder has to cooperate," Agnes said. "Martin Fell. He's been in that office for 16 years. She paused. "Fell is not in Voss's pocket exactly, but he's the kind of man who avoids trouble, and Voss represents trouble avoided for most of his career." "Can he be convinced that Voss is the bigger trouble?" Frank asked. Agnes considered. "Possibly, with the right framing." She looked at Clara. "Mrs. Bright, your documentation, the records you kept from your time in his employ, are any of them related to county administrative matters, specifically anything touching the records office?" Clara reached into the satchel she'd brought with her and withdrew a worn folded paper. "In my second year working for him," she said, "he received a visitor late at night. A man I recognized as a county clerk. I didn't know his name then, but I saw his face again later when I had cause to go into the records office. It was Martin Fell." She set the paper on the table. It was a page from what appeared to be a household account book, with dates and notations in a small, precise hand. I wrote down the date and what I observed. It was the night before a land deed dispute that had been going against Voss for months was resolved in his favor. The table was quiet. Agnes picked up the paper. She read it. She set it down. "Martin Fell," she said, "is going to cooperate with the audit." Agnes went to see Fell that afternoon alone, which was her choice and not negotiable. She said she worked better without witnesses in certain conversations, and Wyatt had learned enough about her to trust that judgment. She was back by evening. She came in and sat down and accepted the coffee that Eliza put in front of her and drank half of it before she spoke. "The audit begins tomorrow morning," she said. "Fell was cooperative." "Cooperative how?" Wyatt asked. "Cooperative in the way a man is when he understands that the choice he's been avoiding is no longer avoidable," she said. "He didn't admit to anything. I didn't ask him to. I showed him what we have. I told him what the hearing would surface, and I told him that a man who facilitated an audit and documented the break-in was in a fundamentally different legal position than a man who obstructed one." She looked at the middle distance. "He's frightened. He's been frightened for years. Fear of Voss and fear of consequences have been pulling him in different directions for 16 years, and he never had to choose because the collision point kept getting postponed." "It's not postponed anymore," Eliza said. "No," Agnes said. "It's not." Clara, from her seat at the corner of the table, said, "Voss doesn't know about me yet, does he?" "I don't think so," Agnes said. "I think he knows Eliza came here with documentation. I don't think he knows the scale of it, and I don't think he knows your name has surfaced." "When he finds out," Clara said, "he'll move against me specifically. He'll try to discredit me before the hearing. I have a history—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are things in my past that are not flattering. Circumstances from before I worked for him that he knows about and has used before when it served him." "What kind of circumstances?" Agnes asked. "Direct, not unkind." Clara looked at the table. "I had a child I couldn't keep," she said quietly. 30 years ago. The child went to another family. In the territory where I lived at that time, a woman who gave up a child was used to suggest instability, poor character." She looked up. "He used it once before, in a different context, to ensure I wouldn't testify against him in a property matter. I was too frightened then." The room was still. "You're not too frightened now," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at her. "No," she said. "I'm 61 years old, and I have watched that man ruin people for 30 years, and I am done being frightened of him." Lillian, from her position at the edge of the table where she'd been sitting quietly, she'd developed an understanding with all of them that she could be present in these conversations if she stayed quiet, and she'd honored it, said, "He can't use something against you if you say it yourself first." Everyone looked at her. She looked back without flinching. "If you tell it yourself in your own words before he does, it's yours. It's not a weapon anymore. Clara looked at the girl for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that was recognizable as the particular emotion of someone who has just heard a simple thing that took them a lifetime to almost understand. "Yes," Clara said softly. "That's right." Lillian nodded and went back to looking at the table. Wyatt looked at his daughter and felt the low, constant ache of all the years he hadn't been there. For that, for all of it, for every moment in which she'd learned something hard without anyone beside her who was supposed to be there. He didn't say anything about it. There was nothing to say that would be adequate. 2 days before the hearing, Voss came to the ranch. Not Brasa, not a letter, not an official notice. Voss himself. He rode out with 2 men who kept a distance that suggested they were there for show rather than necessity. A demonstration of the kind of man who traveled with company, not because he needed it, but because he decided it was appropriate to the situation. He arrived at midday and dismounted at the gate and waited, which was the kind of calculated courtesy that was designed to look respectful and actually signaled he owned the space. Wyatt had seen him coming. He told Eliza and Clara to stay inside. Lillian had started to argue, and he'd looked at her once, and she'd stopped arguing, which told him she understood this was not the moment for principle over practicality. He went out to the gate alone. Voss looked well. That was the maddening thing about him. The years of what he'd done to people hadn't cost him anything visible. He stood in Wyatt's gate looking like a man of position and authority and reasonable temperament, and the gap between what he looked like and what Wyatt knew him to be was dizzying. "Callahan," Voss said, the same pleasant tone as the feed store. "I thought it was time we spoke directly." "We're speaking," Wyatt said. Voss looked at the house. "I'd like to resolve this before it becomes an unnecessary public matter," he said. "The hearing is in 2 days. What happens there doesn't have to happen." "Meaning what exactly?" Wyatt said. "Meaning that a woman who is understandably upset about the past, who has found a sympathetic ear in an old acquaintance, doesn't have to walk into a federal proceeding with accusations that are going to be difficult to substantiate." He tilted his head slightly. "And a rancher with a legitimate water rights question pending doesn't have to have that question complicated further by becoming the center of a public controversy." "You're offering me my water rights," Wyatt said. Voss's expression moved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm suggesting that a properly conducted administrative review could be completed quickly and favorably for a man who isn't unnecessarily complicating an already complicated situation." Wyatt looked at him. He looked at the 2 men at the edge of his property line, sitting their horses with the bored patience of men who'd done this before. He looked back at Voss. "You forged letters," Wyatt said. Not loud, conversational. "You studied the way Eliza and I wrote to each other, and you reproduced it, and you used it to end 2 lives. And then you spent 12 years making sure we stayed ended." He watched Voss's face. The pleasant expression had gone careful now, recalibrating again. "You threatened a woman carrying a child. You built a story around her that made her afraid to come home for over a decade. You have been using a child, an 11-year-old child, as a bargaining piece in a scheme that started because a woman told you no." "Those are significant allegations," Voss said. His voice had gone quieter, more controlled. "They're documented facts," Wyatt said. Something moved through Voss's eyes. It was quick. He was a controlled man, but Wyatt saw it. Not fear exactly, something adjacent to fear. The first real crack in the absolute certainty of a man who had operated without consequence for so long that the possibility of consequence had become theoretical. "You're making a mistake," Voss said. "I've made plenty," Wyatt said. "But not today." He stepped back from the gate and let the space between them clarify itself. Voss stood for a moment. He looked at the house again. He seemed to be calculating something, running the numbers on what was actually in that house, what was actually waiting for him in 2 days, whether there was a move he hadn't made yet that could still change the outcome. Whatever he found in those calculations didn't show on his face. He was too good for that. He turned and walked back to his horse and mounted with the deliberate ease of a man who had learned to exit situations without haste, even when haste was what he felt. At the edge of the property, he stopped and looked back once. Wyatt was still standing at the gate. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he rode away. Wyatt stood at the gate until the sound of hoofbeats was gone. His jaw ached from the last 10 minutes. He hadn't realized how hard he'd been holding it. He went inside. Eliza was in the kitchen with her back against the wall beside the door, which meant she'd been standing close enough to hear through it. Claire was at the table. Lillian was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms at her sides, looking at him with those gray-green eyes. "He came himself," Eliza said. "He must be more frightened than we thought." "Or he wanted to see what we have before the hearing," Clara said. "To judge the room." "What did you see?" Eliza asked Wyatt. "His face. What did you see?" "He knows," Wyatt said. "Not everything we have, but enough to know that what he was expecting isn't what's there." He sat down. He felt the weight of the last 3 weeks settling into his bones all at once. The sleepless nights and the lists and the managing of fear and logistics and a family he hadn't known he had. He's not going to back down. He doesn't know how to back down. It's not something he's had to learn. "Then he'll walk into that room in 2 days," Eliza said. "And he'll try to use the room itself against us. He'll perform certainty. He'll perform authority. He'll look like a reasonable man facing unreasonable accusations. And he'll count on the fact that it's the version of events people are used to accepting." "Yes," Wyatt said. She sat down across from him. "He has no idea about Clara," she said. "He has no idea about Martin Fell. He probably doesn't know about Agnes's audit." "He'll see all of it in 2 days," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. And for the first time since she'd arrived at his ranch with Lillian's hand in hers and 12 years of impossible history between them, for the first time, something in Eliza Monroe's face shifted from the long-held tension of a woman managing an ongoing crisis to the quiet, focused expression of someone who can see the end of a very long road. Not confidence. She was too honest for false confidence, but readiness. Lillian came and sat at the table with them, pulling her knees to her chest in the chair the way she did, and looked between her mother and her father with those careful, bright eyes. 2 days, she said. 2 days, Wyatt confirmed. She nodded. She uncurled from the chair and got up and went to the stove and started water for coffee without being asked, because she'd been doing that for the past week, because she'd noticed it was a thing that needed doing in the evenings, and she was someone who noticed what needed doing and did it. Clara watched her. Then she looked at Wyatt, then at Eliza. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Outside, the November sky was low and gray and pressing down on the land with the particular weight of weather that had decided to arrive. The hearing was in 2 days, and the truth, assembled piece by piece over 12 years by a woman who had refused to stop believing it was worth keeping, was finally going to have its moment in a room that Gideon Voss could not control. Wyatt looked at the stack of Eliza's handwritten pages on the corner of the table. 11 days of work, precise and complete, and devastating in the particular way that true things are devastating, not through drama, but through accumulation, through the relentless weight of fact laid against fact until the shape of what had been done was impossible to look away from. He thought about the version of himself who had put a letter in a fire 11 years ago and decided it was the last time he would think about Eliza Monroe. He had been wrong then in a way he would spend a long time being grateful for. He had not stopped thinking about her. And that refusal of his own grief to follow his instructions, that stubborn insistence of something in him that the story wasn't over even when the evidence said otherwise, had kept a door open that should have been sealed shut. 2 days. He looked at the low gray sky through the kitchen window. 2 days, and then every careful, patient, dangerous thing that had been building toward this would either hold or it wouldn't, and he would find out what came after 12 years of surviving, and whether surviving had been enough to leave room for something else. Lillian set a cup of coffee in front of him. "The biscuits," she said. "Do you have enough flour for tomorrow? I want to try again." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "We have enough." She went back to the stove. And the night before everything, the ranch that had been Wyatt Callahan's solitary life for 12 years held 4 people in its walls. A man, a woman, a child, and an older woman who had crossed state lines to tell the truth. And the sound of ordinary evening things happening in an ordinary kitchen was so strange and so right that Wyatt had to look at his hands to make sure he was actually sitting in it. He was. The morning of November 14th arrived the way important mornings often do, quietly, without ceremony, indifferent to what the people inside it were carrying. Wyatt was up before 4. He didn't sleep past 3:30, which was an hour earlier than his usual poor sleep, and he lay in the dark for a while listening to the ranch and then gave up and got dressed and went to the kitchen and started the stove. The cold had come in fully now. November in Montana was not polite about itself, and the fire took a moment to catch, the way it did when the temperature outside got serious. He heard movement from the back room before he'd finished with the coffee. Lillian appeared in the doorway in her nightclothes and wool socks, her braid unraveled from sleep, looking at him with the expression of someone who had also been awake for a while and had decided to stop pretending. "You couldn't sleep either," she said. "No," he said. She came and sat at the table. He poured her a cup of the weak early coffee. Not the real thing, more hot water with intention, and she wrapped both hands around it the way she'd seen Eliza do. They sat in the quiet for a while. "Are you scared?" she asked. He thought about giving her the adult answer, the reassuring, calibrated version that would make her feel better without being entirely true. He'd been tempted toward that answer a few times over the past 3 weeks, and had always stopped himself, because Lillian had a precise internal meter for honesty, and she'd called him on it the one time he'd come close. "A little," he said. "Not of Voss, more of whether we've done everything right, whether the gaps I didn't see are going to matter." She nodded. That answer satisfied her because it was real. "Mama isn't scared," Lillian said. "She went past scared a long time ago. She's just ready now." "I know," he said. "I've never seen her ready like this before," Lillian said. "All the years in Cheyenne and before that, she was always managing, keeping things from getting worse. This is different." She looked into her cup. "She looks like herself. I don't know how to explain it. She looks like the person she is when nothing is pressing down on her." Wyatt looked at his daughter across the table in the dark, early morning and thought about 12 years of Eliza compressing herself into whatever shape the situation required, smaller, quieter, more careful, less visible. And the particular cost of a life lived in permanent defensive posture. He'd done a version of it himself. He understood the exhaustion of it. But his had been the exhaustion of grief. Hers had been the exhaustion of ongoing active threat, which was different and harder in ways he was only now beginning to fully understand. "She's going to be all right today," he said, "whatever happens." "I know," Lillian said. "I just wanted to hear someone else say it." He understood that too. Eliza came out at 5, dressed and composed in the way she'd been the morning they arrived. Chin slightly lifted, shoulders carrying the weight evenly, eyes clear. She looked at both of them at the kitchen table, and something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than composure. "We're leaving at 7, she said. She sat down and accepted the coffee Wyatt pushed toward her. "Clara and Agnes are meeting us there. Frank and the others will be seated by the time we arrive." "You've gone through this order 100 times, Wyatt said. 107, she said, without any irony. They ate breakfast. Lillian made the biscuits, her 5th attempt, and they were finally right, golden and even, which she received with the satisfaction of someone who had decided to solve a problem and had solved it. She didn't comment on it. She just put the plate in the middle of the table and sat down. Wyatt ate one and said, "There it is." Lillian said, "I know." Eliza looked between them, and for a moment the weight of the morning lifted and she laughed. A real one, brief and surprised out of her. And then it settled back, but softer than before by not. The Harlan's Creek Federal Hall was a building that had been constructed with the intention of projecting governmental authority and had partially succeeded. It was large for the county, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches and a raised platform at the front where the federal official would be seated. It smelled of pine resin and old paper and the particular institutional cold of rooms that were only heated when occupied. It was occupied now. Wyatt had not expected the number of people. He'd expected Frank's group, the ranchers, 7 of them, who had agreed to attend. He'd expected the regular audience of county residents who came to public proceedings out of habit or curiosity. He had not expected the room to be nearly full. He scanned faces as they came in. Some he recognized as people Voss had done business with over the years. People who owed him in various ways, present to provide the weight of his normal social authority. But there were others. People who had no particular investment in Voss, who had come because word had moved through the county in the past 2 weeks in ways Wyatt hadn't fully tracked, and small communities pay attention to situations that disturb the expected order of things. Agnes was near the front, in her deputy uniform, which was deliberate. She caught Wyatt's eye and gave him the slight nod that meant everything was in position. Clara was already seated in the section to the right of the main floor. She sat with the stillness of someone who had made her decision and was finished deliberating about it. She'd told her history to Agnes 2 days ago in writing, with a signed statement, told it in her own words, in her own order, before anyone could use it as a weapon against her. She looked, Wyatt thought, like a woman who had set something down after carrying it a very long time. Lillian sat between Wyatt and Eliza in the 3rd row. She was the only child in the room, and she sat straight and quiet and watched everything with those gray-green eyes that didn't miss anything. Gideon Voss arrived at 5 minutes to the hour with 2 men Wyatt recognized as county legal associates, men who processed paperwork and lent an air of procedural legitimacy. Voss walked to his designated seat with the ease of a man who had been the most powerful person in most rooms he'd entered for 30 years. He acknowledged several people with the slight nod of long familiarity. He looked at Wyatt's section of the room once, briefly, with an expression that had gone fully neutral, the professional neutrality of a man who had arrived prepared. His eyes landed on Clara Bright. It lasted only a second, less than a second, and then he looked away and his expression didn't change in any way that a stranger would notice. But Wyatt was watching, and in that fraction of a second he saw it, a rapid compression, a recalculation, the specific look of a man who has just encountered a variable he didn't account for. Wyatt looked at Eliza. She had seen it too. The federal official, Hargrove, the name Agnes had given them 3 weeks ago, was a man in his late 50s with the look of someone who had presided over a great many proceedings and was not easily impressed by the theater of them. He called the room to order with the efficiency of a man on a schedule, explained the purpose of the hearing in plain language, and invited the opening presentation from Voss's office. One of the legal associates stood and presented Voss's case for the federal appointment. It was thorough and competent, a document of his years of service, his county achievements, his administrative record. It was designed to establish a man of unimpeachable standing before anything else entered the room. Wyatt watched Voss during the presentation. The man sat correctly, attentively, with the slight air of modest patience that powerful men perform when their credentials are being recited. It was a performance, but it was a very practiced one. When the presentation concluded, Hargrove looked at his papers. "I understand there is a matter to be submitted to the record," he said, without particular inflection. "A formal statement pertaining to the candidate's conduct in his capacity as county commissioner." Voss's legal associate shifted in his seat. This was not the scripted sequence. He glanced at Voss. Voss kept his face arranged. Eliza stood up. The room shifted. Not loudly, but perceptibly. The way a room shifts when it knows something is about to happen. She walked to the front and set her written account on Hargrove's table. Then she placed beside it the cloth envelope with the documents. Agnes came forward with the audit report from the records room. Clara stood and walked to the front with her own folder of documentation and placed it on top of the growing stack, and then, without anyone asking her to, in her own sequence, in her own time, she spoke. She said her name. She said how long she had worked for Gideon Voss. She described what she had observed. She said the date, and she said what she had seen, and she said it in the plain, direct language of someone who had rehearsed the facts rather than the performance of them. She said the thing about her past, her child, 30 years ago, before anyone asked, in 2 sentences, without shame, as something that had happened and was part of her history, and was not a weapon anyone else could pick up. Hargrove listened. The room listened. Voss's legal associate stood at one point and began a procedural objection. Hargrove held up one hand and the man sat back down. Then Eliza spoke. She didn't read from the written account. She knew it too well, after 11 days of writing and rewriting. She spoke directly to Hargrove, in the same precise, careful language she'd used to compose it, and she took him through 12 years of a deception that had operated in his federal territory under the authority of a man currently being considered for expanded federal power. She was not dramatic about it. She didn't perform grief or anger. She stated facts in sequence and let the facts carry the weight, which was the only way the facts could carry their full weight. Dramatizing them would have given Voss's people something to call hysteria. The plain presentation of them gave them nothing to call anything except what they were. Halfway through, Wyatt realized the room had gone a quality of quiet that was different from the ordinary quiet of an official proceeding. It was the quiet of people who were doing arithmetic, who were placing what they were hearing against what they had known or suspected or half-believed about Gideon Voss for years, and finding that it added up. Hargrove looked at the documents. He looked at the forged letter. He looked at Agnes, who confirmed the chain of custody. He looked at the audit report, which documented the attempted removal of the county record page. He looked at the numbered gap in the record book itself, which Agnes had brought. Then he looked at Voss. "Mr. Voss," he said, "you'll have the opportunity to respond." Voss stood, and this was the moment, the one Wyatt had been watching for since the morning Eliza walked into his yard. The moment when a man who had never faced real consequence had to stand in a room where consequence was unavoidable and find something to do with himself. Voss was not a small man. He had presence and authority and 30 years of practice at the particular performance of a man who is always in the right. He stood at the front of that room, and he looked at Hargrove, and he began to speak in a measured and reasonable voice about misunderstanding and misremembering, and the way time reshapes memory and the motivations of people who have grievances against successful men in positions of authority. He spoke for several minutes. He was good at it. Wyatt had to give him that. He was very good at it. But the documents were on the table, and there is a specific moment in a room full of people who have been listening carefully when the gap between a man's words and the documented reality in front of everyone becomes too large to maintain with dignity. And Wyatt watched that moment arrive, watched it move through the room like a change in air pressure, person by person, the collective understanding of something that could not be ununderstood. Frank Hollis, 6 rows back, looked at the table with the expression of a man confirming what he'd already accepted. The 2 women from town who had watched Wyatt leave the feed store with curiosity 3 weeks ago were sitting 3 seats apart, and he could see them not looking at each other with the specific care of people processing the same thing simultaneously. At the raised table, Hargrove's pen was moving across his notepad in a way that wasn't notes. It was a decision being written. Voss finished speaking. The room waited. Hargrove set his pen down. "Mr. Voss," he said, "the documentation submitted to this record raises questions of administrative conduct that exceed the scope of this appointment proceeding and will require formal investigation by this office." He looked at the room over his reading glasses. "I am placing a hold on the appointment consideration pending that investigation. The water rights designation for the Callahan Eastern section is referred for immediate resolution under standard process, removed from the Commissioner's discretionary review." He looked at Voss directly. "You are advised that the materials submitted today are now part of the federal record and are not subject to county-level alteration or removal." He closed his folder. "This proceeding is adjourned." Well, the room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It did the thing that rooms of ordinary people do when something very large has just been established. It exhaled, and then it began the low, careful murmur of people processing what they'd witnessed and what it meant for the world they lived in, which had just shifted in ways that would take time to fully understand. Voss stood at the front of the room for a moment longer than he needed to. His legal associates were already gathering papers with the efficient movements of men disengaging from a sinking position. They said things to him quietly. He didn't appear to hear them. He looked across the room. He looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. And Wyatt, watching from 3 rows back, saw the thing that he hadn't expected to see. Not defeat in the dramatic sense, not the collapse of a villain, just a man who had built a version of himself on the certainty of his own power, and who was standing in the first moment of the rest of his life without it, and who did not know who he was in that absence. Voss turned and walked out. Not fast, not slow. with the last remnant of the bearing that had carried him for 30 years, even when the substance behind it was gone. Wyatt would learn later, weeks later, through Agnes, that Voss left the territory before the formal investigation completed. Not fled, exactly. Made arrangements. The careful, quiet departure of a man with enough resources to relocate his life somewhere the weight of his history hadn't preceded him. Whether the federal investigation followed him adequately was a question for other people in other offices. In Harlan's Creek, in the county that had lived under his influence for 30 years, he was simply gone. And the absence of him was something people stepped into carefully at first, the way you step into a room where furniture has been moved, noticing the space before you know what to do with it. Outside the federal hall in the cold November air, the group gathered without planning to. Wyatt and Eliza and Lillian, Frank and the ranchers, Agnes, Clara. They stood on the wooden sidewalk with their coats pulled against the wind, and nobody said anything for a moment. Lillian was the one who spoke first. "Is it over?" she asked. Agnes looked at her with the honest assessment she always gave the girl. "The hearing is over. The investigation will take time. But yes, the part where he can act against your family is over." Lillian nodded. She looked at her mother. Eliza was standing with her arms at her sides. Not crossed, not braced, just standing, breathing the cold air. She looked, Wyatt thought, exactly as Lillian had described that morning, like herself, like the person she was when nothing was pressing down on her. He'd only seen that person fully once before, a long time ago, but he recognized it. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was 12 years between them, and also somehow not 12 years at all, because grief doesn't count time the way clocks do, and neither does the particular stubbornness of two people who had never quite finished something. Frank clapped Wyatt on the shoulder once, hard, the way men like Frank expressed things they weren't going to say. Then he turned to the other ranchers, and the group began to disperse, slowly, with the unhurried movement of people who had done what they came to do. Clara stood with Agnes for a moment. "Thank you," Eliza said to Clara. "I need you to know what it took for you to come here." Clara shook her head slightly. "I came here for myself as much as for you," she said. "Don't make me selfless. It doesn't fit." Eliza almost smiled. Agnes told them the formal water rights designation would be resolved within 2 weeks, standard process, no discretionary delays, a different official overseeing it. She told them the forged documents were now federal evidence and therefore beyond any county-level reach. She said these things in the practical tone she used for facts, and then she said, less practically, "You did this right, all of it. You didn't cut corners and you didn't break, and you gave the truth a structure it could stand up in. That matters." She left. Clara left. The three of them, Wyatt, Eliza, Lillian, stood on the sidewalk in the quiet that followed. "I'm hungry," Lillian said. Wyatt looked at her. Eliza looked at her. Then they both looked at each other. "There's a place down the street," Wyatt said. They walked down the street and had a meal that was ordinary and slightly overpriced for what it was, and deeply welcome. Hot food and a warm room and no particular conversation, because some moments don't need conversation. They need the simple fact of people sitting together without something threatening to end it. Lillian ate everything and looked at the dessert list. "Pie," she said. "Order it," Wyatt said. She did. Ishchach. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing was simple. The formal investigation moved slowly, the way federal processes did, and there were weeks when it seemed to be moving toward outcomes that were less definitive than the hearing had suggested, and weeks when Agnes brought news that moved it forward again. The water rights designation came through in December, as she'd promised. A routine ruling by a different official who looked at the straightforward survey and signed it without delay, which was the most ordinary and also the most significant administrative event that had happened on Wyatt's property in 15 years. Eliza and Lillian stayed. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no single conversation in which Wyatt said stay and Eliza said yes, and everything was understood. It was more like the accumulation of small decisions. Lillian enrolling in the school in Harlan's Creek, Eliza taking on correspondence work for a land records office in town, that needed someone with her organizational precision, the gradual rearrangement of the house to reflect that it held 3 people rather than 1. The spare room stopped being a spare room. Lillian's books appeared on the shelf in the front room. Eliza's coat hung on the hook beside Wyatt's. They were imperfect about it in the ways that people are imperfect when they are learning each other again after a long separation. Or, in some respects, learning each other for the first time, because the people they had been at 23 were not the people they were now, and there were moments of friction and moments of misunderstanding and moments when the weight of 12 years sat in a room with them like a third party that nobody had invited. Wyatt was not easy to live with. He was quiet in ways that could feel like distance, and he had habits of solitude that took time to revise, and he sometimes handled things alone out of long practice when he should have said something to Eliza first. She called him on it the 3rd time it happened, directly and without meanness, and he accepted it the way he accepted accurate information, without defensiveness, because it was true. Eliza was not easy to live with either. She was precise in ways that could feel like criticism. She reorganized things and then forgot she'd reorganized them. She woke in the night sometimes and couldn't settle. And on those nights she was difficult to reach. Not cold, but sealed in a way that took time to understand was old habit rather than present feeling. He didn't push on those nights. He learned to sit near enough to be present without requiring her to perform being all right. Lillian navigated both of them with the experienced skill of a child who had spent 11 years as her mother's primary company and understood adult emotional weather better than most adults understood it in themselves. She also burned the biscuits once more after the successful batch, overcorrected on the heat, which she was annoyed about, and got into 2 arguments with Wyatt about the horses, both of which she was partially right about, and made one friend at school named Dora, who came to the ranch on a Saturday and spent 4 hours helping Lillian try to teach Seven, the gray horse, a command that Seven had no interest in learning, the ordinary accumulation of a life. In February, Wyatt rode out to the eastern section to check the fence line after a hard freeze. The water in the lower creek was solid, but the channel itself was intact, the water rights designation now sitting properly in the county records, legal and permanent, and no longer contingent on the goodwill of a man who had used it as leverage. He sat on his horse and looked at that stretch of land, the land he'd worked alone for so many years, and felt something that he didn't immediately name because he was a practical man and didn't always have names for things. He stayed there long enough that Eliza came out on the bay to find him. She rode up and stopped beside him and looked at the same stretch of land. "It's yours," she said. "Ours," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the land. "I mean that," he said. "Not as a... I mean it as a fact. What's here is ours." He paused. He was not built for speeches. He was built for saying things plainly and trusting the plainness of them. I spent 12 years holding this place together alone, and the whole time I thought the point was just to keep it. I was wrong about that. The point was to have something worth sharing. He looked at her. "I know we have a long way to go. I know we're still figuring out what we are to each other after everything. I'm not rushing anything." Eliza looked at him for a moment. "You just told me it's ours," she said. "Yeah," he said. "That's not nothing, Wyatt." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked back at the land. The February sky was pale and high, and the creek reflected it in the gaps where the ice was thin. The ranch stretched out to the north and east in the way it always had. The same land, the same sky, the same fence lines he'd built and mended and rebuilt over 15 years. "I spent 12 years being angry at you," she said quietly. "Not at you. At the version of you I thought had abandoned me. I know it wasn't you. I know that completely. But the feeling doesn't always follow the knowing." She looked at him. "There are days when I'm still angry. Not at you, but at the years. At what was taken." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you because you should know what you're taking on," she said. "Not the simple version." "I don't want the simple version," he said. "I'm 41 years old. I'm done with simple versions." She looked at him for a long moment. The bay shifted under her, impatient with standing still. "Okay," she said. They rode back to the ranch together. Osen, spring. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in Montana, grudgingly, in fits and starts, with two late freezes that undid what the first warm weeks had suggested. By April, the land was finally deciding to commit to the season, the grass coming back in the way Wyatt had always liked best about spring on the ranch, that particular green that didn't last long before it dried to gold. One evening in April, Lillian came in from the barn where she'd been working with Seven, who had improbably started responding to a command that Lillian had spent 6 weeks teaching her with the patience of someone who had decided the horse was going to learn this whether the horse agreed or not. And she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her parents sitting at the table. They were doing nothing special. Wyatt was going over the spring supply list. Eliza was reading something for her work. They were simply in the same room, in the way that people who have become accustomed to each other exist in the same room. Without performance, without effort, in the ordinary, settled way of people who have stopped being strangers. Lillian stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. "What?" Eliza said, without looking up. "Nothing," Lillian said. She came in and sat at the table and pulled her own book from the shelf and opened it. But before she turned to her page, she looked up once more at the room. At the kitchen she'd learned to make eggs in, at the table where she'd sat through a dozen serious conversations and 100 ordinary meals, at the two people who were her parents and who were, imperfectly and genuinely, finding their way back to each other. And she held what she saw for a moment. Not forever. Not with the dramatic weight of someone cataloging a memory. Just a second. Just long enough. Then she turned to her page and read, "There are things that are taken from people that cannot be given back. 12 years is 12 years. A child's first word, her first fall, the 1,000 small ordinary moments of a life. Those are gone, and no amount of reckoning or justice or arrived truth restores them." Wyatt understood that. Eliza understood it. They were not people who pretended otherwise. But here is what Wyatt had not understood, in the years of surviving alone, in the years of keeping the ranch and keeping himself and calling that a life. Loss doesn't have an expiration date, but neither does the thing that survives it. He had loved Eliza Monroe when he was 23 years old, and he had believed that love was the casualty of what happened between them. He had been wrong. It had not died. It had simply had nowhere to go, and so it had lived in the cold places of him, unspent, waiting for something he'd stopped believing would come. He was not a sentimental man. He did not think in terms of fate or stories being meant to go a certain way. He thought in terms of ground and weather and what you built against both. What he knew was this: a woman had kept evidence for 12 years in a world that gave her no reason to believe it would ever matter. She had kept it anyway. That was not fate. That was will. That was the specific human stubbornness that refuses to accept that the truth is permanently less powerful than a lie. And a child had grown up knowing only half of what she should have known, and had become, in that incomplete situation, someone extraordinarily whole. Not because it was easy, because she had chosen every day to pay attention to hard things and not be destroyed by them. These were not small things. On a Thursday evening in late April, Wyatt Callahan walked down to the creek at the eastern edge of his property, their property, where the water was running clear now, fully thawed, moving the way it had moved every spring for as long as he'd owned this land. Eliza was there ahead of him. She'd taken to walking in the evenings, the same route each time, which he'd started to notice without commenting on because some habits are private even between people who are building something together. She heard him coming and didn't turn around. She was watching the water. He came and stood beside her. The evening was mild. The sky to the west was doing the thing April skies did at this hour, going colors that had no good names, orange and rose and something deeper underneath. The creek caught pieces of it. "This is where you used to come when you were thinking," she said. "Even when we were young, you'd come to whatever water was nearest." "I didn't know you knew that," he said. "I paid attention," she said. They stood there a while. "I'd like to try," he said. She looked at him. "Not performing anything," he said. "Not because of the years we lost or to fix what was broken, just I'd like to try, because you're someone I want to know for the rest of whatever time I have, and I'm done pretending that's not true." Eliza turned back to the water. He couldn't see her face from this angle, which was possibly why he'd said it standing beside her rather than facing her. "I know you would," she said, quietly. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It's a yes," she said, with the caveat that I'm not easy, and I know it, and some mornings I'm going to be somewhere you can't reach, and you'll have to let me get there in my own time. I know that, he said. And Lillian comes first, she said, in everything. Lillian comes first, he said, without hesitation. Then, yes, she said. The creek moved. Behind them, somewhere up the slope toward the house, they could hear Lillian's voice. She'd brought Dora out again, the two of them arguing about something in the cheerful, escalating way of girls who argue for the pleasure of it rather than because anything is actually at stake. Wyatt listened to the sound of it. He thought about all the mornings he'd stood somewhere on this land alone and told himself it was enough, that the ranch was enough, that a life maintained was a life lived. He knew now what he should have always known, or maybe what you can only know by losing it and getting it back in a different shape. A life maintained is just the floor. The actual living happens above it, in the difficult, imperfect, unrepeatable moments of people who matter to each other, trying. He was going to try. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything.